Welcome to Moving Forward, conversations on culture, identity, healing, and hope. I'm your host, Linda Anderson, and I created this podcast as a space for real, heartfelt conversations with people who are reflecting, evolving, and boldly stepping into what's next. This podcast was born out of my own journey through seasons of loss, transition, and transformation, and my belief that healing happens when we come together to share our stories. My hope is that these conversations will inspire you to pause, reflect, and find courage as you move forward in your own life. Today, I'm joined by Robert Hubbell. Robert is a writer and thoughtful commentator whose work helps readers make sense of complex legal, political, and social issues with clarity, context, and care. Through his Substack, he invites people to slow down, think critically, and engage more intentionally with the world around them. Born and raised in Los Angeles, Robert developed an early curiosity and aptitude for understanding complex ideas, something that has shaped both his thinking and his writing. He studied at Loyola Marymount, where his education further honed his analytical skills and deepened his interest in ethics, responsibility, and social issues. At a time when so many conversations feel rushed, reactive, or polarized, Robert's voice stands out for its steadiness and thoughtfulness. His work reminds us that democracy is not passive, that understanding, reflection, and informed engagement matter. Today, we'll talk about Robert's journey, the role of critical thinking and writing as civic responsibility, and how clarity and reflection can serve as pathways toward healing and hope. Robert, I am so thankful that you've given up some of your time, and I welcome you here to this podcast.
Well, thank you, Linda. I'm delighted to be here today. It's my honor.
So, Robert, first question I have for you is, you've often demonstrated an ability to make complex ideas accessible. Looking back, what experiences early in your life helped shape your curiosity and love of critical thinking?
There are really two sources for this, or three. One is I would trace back to my college education. I was an English major, and of course, was always explicating poems and essays and the like. And I took one class on literary criticism, taught by Robert Caro, S.J., at Loyola Marymount University. And we covered all of the great essayists and critical thinkers, Pope, Dryden, Locke, in really very deep, thoughtful way. And that, I think, gave me a toolbox to just critically think about the written word, about ideas, and about communication. Of course, then I was a lawyer for 40 plus years, a securities litigator. And so I was always writing briefs to judges or making arguments to juries. And I grew up as a lawyer during a time when there was a movement away from legalese. There was an effort to write in plain English. And then as I became a more seasoned lawyer and tried to communicate with juries, I really came to understand that in order to communicate effectively, you had to be clear. And most importantly, you had to say the most important thing first. Because frequently, even with a very well-respected judge, you might have 60 seconds of his time to persuade him in the intro to a brief before a jury. I went through a number of jury trials and jury exercises. I learned that most juries make up their minds in the first minutes of a case. So when you stand up and you have something to say, it better be thought through, it better be important, and it should be the most important thing, rather than going through a lot of setting forth of predicates and throat clearing, etc. Say the most important thing first, and from there on out, have a logical flow of what it is you want to persuade someone of and stick to it. So that's I attribute it to my education and to my law school background. And then one very specific instance, um, which would be the third source, is I attempted to read a biography of Albert Einstein, which I still have on my shelf today. And when it was a very serious, deeply technical biography, and I could not understand the ideas, the quantum physics and relativistic ideas in the biography. I think it was Walter Isaacson's book. And I went to someone and I said, you know what? I don't understand this quantum physics stuff. I wasn't a science major. Can you recommend a book for me to read? So they recommended a book on quantum mechanics and relativity, and I read it, and it opened my eyes. It was an epiphany. And I began to read very extensively and very deeply in quantum mechanics and relativity, um, which is good. I mean, it's really great. It taught me lots of things. But what I found is that in the science world, as soon as you start to talk about superposition and the double slit experiment, people want to introduce magical thinking. They want to introduce concepts that have nothing to do with science and have everything to do with, what in the critical thinking world is called woo, just stuff people make up because they don't understand what's really going on. And so there is in the science community an entire movement
Mm,
called the critical thinking movement.
mm,
And I began to follow writers and podcasters in that movement. And I think that really was the final gloss that helped me sort of focus on the pith, the real ideas of what underlies the nature of reality rather than the stuff that people are trying to make you believe, which is based on disinformation and ignorance.
mhm. And I hope the listeners are hearing you with your reading. They can't, this is all audio, so they can't see, but you are definitely an avid reader. And I want to get that across. So the other thing, though, too, you talked about critical thinking, but also I was wondering your education at Loyola Marymount, how did it influence the way you approach ethics, analysis, and responsibility in your work today?
So I graduated, as did my wife, from Loyola Marymount University undergraduate, and then I went to Loyola Law School, both of which are Jesuit institutions. And I will say that the Jesuit philosophy completely shaped my thinking about philosophy and ethics and social responsibility. I mean, the Jesuits are a deeply intellectual and also socially active organization within the church. And their mission is to change young men and women into sort of their ideology. Well, they succeeded with me, and it has stuck with me. Um, there is a very deep component of social justice in in the Jesuit philosophy, but also, a real commitment to education and science, and deeply thoughtful thinking, as well as a spiritual element of discipline. Um, so you know, it about the second or third year at Loyola Marymount, I realized, oh, they have this whole program, which is designed to shape the students in their universities. And when it came time to go to law school, um, and I was fortunate to have done well at Loyola Marymount, and I had options in law school, and one of my options was to go to Loyola Law School, fortunately on a full scholarship. And I made the conscious decision that I wanted to go to a law school that continued to teach in the Jesuit discipline, in the Jesuit framework of thought and ethics and social justice. So it had a profound impact, really, on me and my wife, who also was a triple Loyola Marymount Jesuit degree earner. So it has really affected both of our lives very deeply.
I appreciate you bringing in your wife too, because I know that she has a lot of experience at Loyola and in education. So the next question I have for you though, was there a moment in your personal or professional life when you realized that how we think is just as important as what we think?
Yeah, I would say that traces back to my time as a lawyer. One of the great things about being a litigator is, every year or two, you have to completely reinvent your substantive area of expertise because, at least in my practice, I became involved in a series of very large cases in some new subject matter. And I was frequently preparing witnesses, expert witnesses who had very deep technical knowledge that far exceeded mine, that I couldn't hope to replicate, and that I would then have to cross-examine the other side's expert witnesses. And I quickly learned that since you can't know more than the expert witness, what you can do is know how to think critically and to take apart the thought process, either to present it to someone like a jury or to undermine it on cross-examination. And so, I actually realized, hey, I can do this. I can examine an economist. I can examine someone, who has a degree in medical science. I can examine someone who, has an advanced degree in let me just think of a different area in, accounting, for example, an area which, I don't know anything about, but I know enough to know how to ask the process questions of how people got to their answers. And so it became a tool for me to focus on how people think, um, as really the way in which I interrogated or investigated what they did.
Mhm. I know you a little bit, so and the listeners really don't, but your life journey has definitely moved you forward to different places. And right now, you have this article in Substack that is global, and readers are everywhere throughout this world. But so your Substack has become a trusted place for so many readers. But what initially compelled you to begin writing publicly in this way?
Well, so let me tell you the origin story of today's edition newsletter on Substack. I have three adult daughters. When they were fearful in 2016 that Donald Trump would win for the reason that many women were fearful that Donald Trump might win. And many people, frankly, who wanted to look away from what he represented and how he treated people. And my wife and I assured our daughters in a very adult way, don't worry, Trump's not going to win. The adults have this. We'll take care of this. And of course, Trump won. And that was devastating to everyone in my family, including me and my wife. But our daughters were just devastated in the rawest form of the word. And they, like tens of millions of Americans, began to look away from the news, to sort of shrink within themselves to avoid having to engage with kind of the awfulness of the first few months of what was happening under the Trump administration 1.0. And my wife and I were having a conversation on our living room couch in this house where I'm talking to you from, and we sort of were saying, well, what can we do to help our daughters through this traumatic time? And my wife suggested that I just simply write a nightly email to them, telling them what was happening in the world, in a way that was, digestible, understandable, hopeful at the same time, without being Pollyannish. So in November of 2016, I began writing a nightly email to my family. And then in February of 2017, shortly after the inauguration, three or four family friends said, you know what? We're feeling exactly the same way as your daughters. Can you include us on your nightly email? So I did. So roll forward 8 years, and now instead of five or eight people getting it nightly, 160,000 people get it, follow it every day. For the first 3 or 4 years, I was a practicing attorney, and I asked people to keep it on the down low as a communication, a private communication between me and them, because not all of my clients necessarily would agree with my political outlook. But I'm retired now, and once I retired, I moved over to Substack because Heather Cox Richardson is on Substack, and she's kind of created this pro-democracy space on Substack. And so it's just astounding to me how the newsletter has reached throughout, as you said, worldwide. I was at a protest this morning on January 6th, and I ran into a woman who was also protesting on this overpass. And I said, hi. And she recognized me and she said, I want to tell you, I was in India on, around the world cruise, and one of my shipmates said to me while we were commiserating over the state of politics in America, you know what you need to do? You need to read this guy, Robert Hubbell, on Substack. So she said, I found you in India.
Wow.
And so I have come to learn that, people all across America and, across the world are anxious and afraid and concerned about what is happening, and they want someone to talk to them in a truthful way, but in a way that sort of gets away from the rage bait, algorithm of Twitter, and that tries to get to the substance of what's happening. And my niche is really to try to put things into perspective. Because if all we do is focus exclusively on this present moment, the 5 seconds before and the 5 seconds that we're heading into, we can drive ourselves crazy.
Mhm.
And that's a natural human response. If you feel that way, that's good. It proves you're human. But that's not the fact of the matter is we are living in a moment that began 8 years ago and that will wrap up, in another decade or two. And so from a longer perspective, we can see that we are living through an arc of history, much like other arcs that took place before us and that people endured and survived through. And we can do the same thing if we just step back a little bit and not react to, the thing that is happening in the last 15 seconds. And of course, that problem is exacerbated by our phones and our computers because the news cycle has shrunk from 24 hours to 8 hours to 4 hours to 2 minutes to 15 seconds.
Mm.
Sitting here right now, I've gotten two breaking news alerts I can see on my computer. And so while our predecessors had to deal with difficult situations, they weren't on the battlefield at Gettysburg getting an immediate report of, this group over here that was lost people and that group over there that's been overwhelmed. Instead, they had to live in the moment, and act in a proactive way. And I think that's what I try to do is I try to urge people to understand that we are engaged in an arc of history that we can affect as long as we don't give up, as long as we don't quit, as long as we keep trying, we will win, we will endure, we will abide, but we can't be overwhelmed. We can't give in to the fear mongering and the rage baiting and the algorithms
Mm.
that will take, an innocent search for a question about cats and in 6 steps take us to a neo-Nazi site,
Mm.
which is, truthfully how some of these large social media platforms work.
Mm.
Apologies for that rambling answer,
That's
but
okay. But
that's the newsletter in a nutshell.
it is. And one of the things though too that I'm hoping the listeners are getting from you is that you do model a tone that's calm, which is so needed right now. You're calm, you're grounded, you're definitely principled. Even when you're addressing these topics, these difficult, divisive topics. So how intentional is that choice?
Um, It is and it isn't. It was a journey of self-discovery. So I also record the newsletter every night. And I
Mm.
did so because we have a friend who's blind. and he was listening to the newsletter through a recorded voice or a generated voice on his computer. And he asked if I could record the newsletter so that he could listen to it in my voice. And so I did. And to my great surprise, my guess is 25, 30, 40% of the people who read the newsletter actually listen to the newsletter.
Mm.
And what I have discovered, um, you and I know each other a little bit. I'm kind of a low key person. I'm actually a man of few words, except when you get me talking and then you can't shut me up. But I have sort of a generally calm demeanor. And when I began reading the newsletter, at first I got a lot of complaints from people who said, you read it too slow. It puts me to sleep. I'm not going to listen to it. And then I started hearing from more and more and more people.
Mm.
I really like your calm, deliberative description of the news, even on very difficult topics, because it takes out of the delivery of what is sometimes very hard news, this sort of breathlessness and breaking, false sense of breaking news that everything is a crisis. Lots of things are bad, but it doesn't mean everything is a crisis. And if we can reflect on these things in a calm way, I think it's very helpful. And so I actually have been just very surprised at how many people say to me that the only way that they can interact with the news is to listen to me read it to them.
Mm.
There still are people who say that when they can't go to sleep, they listen to me, which I still take as a compliment. But it wasn't intentional at first, and now I understand that it is actually very helpful to people. And so even when I'm addressing extraordinarily difficult and painful topics, I maintain an even measured tone that people find helpful.
So I'm sure you come across, people are listening to your newsletter and they're reading it, but you also come along people that want to talk about it to you. So how do you create that space for productive dialogue when there is fear, there's misinformation, or people are exhausted? When exhaustion takes hold, how do you create that space?
Well, interesting. I am not a psychologist or a
Mm.
psychotherapist or a mental health professional. I'm a lawyer by training. Um, but I have come to understand that the most important aspect of what I do is to take people where they are and to understand their feelings and to validate them. Uh, I get people, in today's email, I got a very lengthy email from a reader of 8 years who said, this Venezuelan thing has just finally broken me after 8 years. And where you have to start with that is to say, lots of people feel that way. If you feel that way, that's not only understandable, it proves you get it. You understand what's going on. Of course, you should feel that way. And then many people who express anxiety and fear, it's frequently because they feel some special obligation to make things right. We all know people like that. And what I say to them is, yes, we can shape the outcome of the future, but it's not all on your shoulders.
Mm.
There are, at this very moment that you and I are speaking, tens of millions of people who are out defending democracy, attempting to get back to the original principles of the Constitution, to take us back to a time when we treat one another humanely and decently, when we lift up education and civic discourse. So what I try to do is to, as I said, understand and validate and listen to where people are coming from, assure them that they can take care of themselves, that they can take a break, that if they do, we'll be here waiting for them to come back. And frequently that's enough to um, to help them make it through a moment of crisis. Now, on the substance, I will say it is much more difficult. I have learned to identify the trolls who come in and they have no purpose other than engaging you in a disingenuous conversation. And there's some book out there that says this is how you troll liberals. And it always begins with some innocent question. I just was wondering.
Mhm.
I, at that, it's so old now that when that happens, it's like, no, thank you. I'm not going to engage in that.
Mhm.
Um, People who are really genuine about this don't start with this, sort of pseudo Socratic method of I was just wondering, but instead come to you with sort of real angst and real pain and say, I just read this, or I just heard this, or my son, or my husband, or my second cousin just said or did this. What do you recommend? How do I engage with them when, for example, we're on January 6th? They want to tell me that January 6th was an inside job by the FBI. And
Mhm.
I think that the most honest and effective advice I can give to people is to make a good faith effort to listen to and connect and educate people about the true facts. But after you have made that effort, it is counterproductive and harmful to you, to your mental health, to continue trying to push a rock up a hill that will not be moved. And we need to think about, the limited bandwidth we have and just ask ourselves a question. Should we devote 98% of our bandwidth trying to change the mind of our second cousin? Or should we take that same bandwidth and go out and try to touch thousands of people through protesting, through postcarding, through phone banking, through civic education, through writing letters to the editor? And what I say to them is, it is not your purpose in life to change the mind or to correct the thinking of any one individual. Yes, try, make a good faith effort, and then move on. Because the good that you will do with other people far outweighs whatever difficulty there may be caused by the one or two people in your life who are causing you pain. So let me stop there. And if you have a follow-up question, I'm happy to answer it because there's a lot more
Yeah.
at this particular point.
I do, but I think you answered part of it, but maybe you can summarize it. And that is individuals want to help, they want to contribute, whether they're in education, they're in law, business, community work. So, how can they contribute meaningfully to the health of our democracy?
So everybody has a gift. There's a different pathway for everyone. What I would say is this. Most Americans are afraid and anxious about the future of our democracy, and they don't know what to do. Or they are overwhelmed. They're taking care of two children at a home. They're taking care of aging parents. They're trying to hold down two jobs so that they can repay student loans. And they don't have the time to
Mm.
engage in the civic actions that are necessary to put our democracy back on the right course. So, what I would say, if you are a person who does have the time, who can do one thing, do it. Because by doing so, by speaking out, by being seen, you will inspire others. I guarantee it. And you will never know how many lives you will touch, how many people you will motivate, how many people you will give solace to simply because you stand on your own street corner with a sign that says justice. You will lift up people in their dark hours. And so if you are one of the people who can do that, if you can write letters to the editor, if you're good with technology, if you have a social media following, post affirming pro-democracy articles and links and
Mm.
messages. Do whatever you can, because however you raise your hand, you will be a light unto others. As I said, in ways you will never know. And I hear this story from readers all the time who say, I wrote something and I write thousands of words a day and tens of thousands a month and millions of words a year. So it's hard for me to keep track of what I write, but I will run into someone on the street or at a reader meeting and they will say, you know what? You wrote X, Y, and Z, and I took it to my husband, cousin, daughter, and I shared it with them and it helped them.
Mm,
And you can do the same thing. Everyone listening to the sound of my voice and your voice can do exactly the same thing. People are desperate for social cues about how we should be acting in a moment when it seems like everything is crashing around us. And if you're the person who says, stay calm and follow me, everything's going to be all right as long as we don't quit, you are a true patriot of American democracy.
mhm. So as I listen to you, Robert, I think about you yourself. And so when you do step away from writing and analyzing, what restores you?
Well, as you know, Jill and I are blessed with five beautiful grandchildren.
Mm,
We're very involved in their lives, in our daughters' lives. I would say between the newsletter and our grandchildren, that accounts for 95% of my time. Much of the rest of it is frankly spent meeting and interacting with readers.
mm,
Um, I have spent most of today, one way or another, protesting with other readers, interacting with readers through phone calls and emails. After I get done with this, I'll be interviewing the head of the Venezuelan American Caucus. So it's
mhm,
become a big part of my life. But I continue to have a deep interest in science. And I'm an astrophotographer. As you know, at the end of every one
mhm,
of my newsletters, I include one of my astrophotography pictures. And, most of the objects that I'm posting are nebula or deep sky objects that are within the
mhm.
Milky Way.
Yeah.
So they're within 100,000 light years, let's say. But I also publish, photos of galaxies that are 30 or 40 million light years away. And that brings me back to this sense of perspective. Here we are worried about what's going to happen an hour from now. And yet light is arriving this evening on Earth that departed the galaxies M81 and M82, you know, 2 or 3 million years ago. And it will fall in my backyard, in your
Mhm,
backyard. And it took a long time to get here, and a lot happened in the interim. So, if if we can put ourselves into that perspective, and astrophotography helps me to do it, it
mhm,
when you talk about those time scales and those distances, some people could get the wrong message, which is nothing matters, and the opposite is true. Everything it against that time scale, everything matters because so far as we can tell, and we can see very far into the universe. We're the only planet that harbors intelligent life. And as Carl Sagan said, it doesn't get any more special than that. Nobody's coming to help us. And the fact that we have this beautiful gift means that we have to act with kindness and compassion and treat not only one another gently and kindly, but also the earth, the only earth we've ever known, in the phrase of Carl Sagan. So those are the things that I do to help sort of keep my sanity and help me stay centered during these difficult times.
So I could have this conversation go on forever. I'm learning so much myself, but I do have one final question so we can wrap this up for the listeners too is what question do you wish more people would ask themselves as they navigate, like you said, this moment in history?
Um, what I would urge people to do is to ask themselves whether they are aware of any analogs in American history or world history that would give them confidence that we will make it through this moment. Because you do not have to reach back very far to see that Americans have lived through much more stressful times.
Mm,
I mean, my God, African Americans in the Jim Crow South uh, could witness a black man being shot in a town square by a white man, witnessed by 12 people who ended up being on the jury, and that jury would acquit the
mm,
perpetrator. They lived that experience, and yet they didn't give up. John Lewis, when he stood at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge and people told him, don't go over that bridge, you don't know what's on the other side of the bridge, he didn't give up. He walked up that bridge, and as a result, he was beaten savagely and had his skull broken. And then the next Tuesday, he was out of the hospital and back to march across that bridge again. So, what I would say is look to our own shared experience as Americans for analogs when we have lived through more difficult times. The other thing I just want to encourage people is to not accept things that they're told as being true. I think this morning I got 5 or 6 panicked emails from readers who forwarded me 2 separate Substack publications that were just awful. They were misleading. They were doomsaying. They were, whatever. They were conspiracy theories.
Mm.
And they were saying, please help me. I'm so frightened. Is this true? And I'm not criticizing the readers, but I want you to know it took me all of 10 seconds to come up with very detailed answers available to anyone on the internet that prove that the articles that they were sending me were just conspiracy theories.
Mm.
And yet people did not feel empowered to do that on their own. And I think as we wrestle with the questions of AI and as the internet becomes more ubiquitous, it runs everything in our lives, it anticipates all of our movements, we have a greater obligation to think critically and to have the skills and the confidence to say, you know what, that doesn't sound right. In fact, when I wrote back to one of the readers today, she said to me, oh, thank God. She said, exactly what you're saying is how I felt, but I didn't know, where to look. And it is difficult, I will grant you, to fight the disinformation, and particularly now that we have AI that's designed to sound like humans and look like, video that's real. But we're still at a place where we can ferret out the truth. And so one of the things that we must do in order to preserve our democracy is to be intelligent, skeptical consumers of information. And I don't mean skeptical in a cynical way. I mean skeptical in a critical thinking way. We must be able to do that. So perspective and critical thinking, those are the 2 things that I wish people would think about more themselves, because it will empower them to deal with the challenges that we face every day.
Like I said, I wish this conversation didn't have to end, but Robert, I want to thank you so much for this definitely thoughtful and grounded conversation, and really ending it with the word hope, because that's what this podcast is about. One of the many things about the conversation is hope. I appreciate your clarity, your care, and the intention that you do bring to this work, and the way you invite people to engage more deeply in the world around them. Your writing is definitely a reminder that understanding is not about winning arguments, but about showing up informed, and I hope that got across, reflective and responsible, especially in moments, and here's key, that feel uncertain or overwhelming. So to our listeners, if today's conversation resonated with you, I encourage you to spend time with Robert's writing and reflect on how you too are engaging with the ideas, systems, and communities that are shaping our shared future. So again, thank you for joining us on Moving Forward. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and continue moving forward.